A mother begged me to send an ambulance for her dying child, but my supervisor wouldn't let me. 3 weeks into my job as a 911 operator, I got a call from a screaming mother, crying about her 3-year-old baby bleeding out, begging me to send the ambulance. I started transferring the call, but that's when my supervisor Jackson noticed the side of town this woman was calling from. Before I could dispatch, he rolled his chair behind me and entered his override code, locking me out of the system completely. "We can't send units there right now. We need ambulances available for Fairfield Gardens where the donors live. There's a frat party happening there and their sons might get hurt. Her baby's bleeding out!" I screamed, trying to type, but my keyboard wouldn't respond. I quickly realized the system was completely frozen and I couldn't contact anyone, all while the mother was begging through my headset. "Babies bleed all the time," Jackson said loud enough for her to hear. "Kid probably a scraped knee or something. But the senator's drunk son might crash his BMW at that party. That's what matters," Jackson said, pulling out his personal laptop where I could see him manually rerouting ambulances away from her address. I reached for the emergency phone to call dispatch directly, but he'd already unplugged it, holding the cord in his hand while saying, 23 minutes. That's how long your console stays locked. For 23 minutes, I sat helpless watching supervisor control active flash on my frozen screen, while the single mother of two tried to save her 3-year-old son who'd fallen through their apartment's broken window. "Please, he's so cold, he won't open his eyes," she sobbed at minute 5. And all I could do was lie that help was coming while Jackson sat at his laptop, manually denying every dispatch request that auto-generated from her call, clicking reject over and over with the same finger he used to point at funny videos on his phone. By minute 8, Shania's voice had changed from screaming to whispering because she was using all her strength to apply pressure to the wound. I couldn't take it anymore and launched myself across the room to another workstation. But Jackson had locked them all remotely, tackling me when I tried to rip the cables from his laptop. We crashed into the desk, him pinning my arms while I screamed for someone to help. The other dispatchers actually looked away, all terrified of doing the right thing. The mother's Vietnam veteran neighbor came into her home at minute 12, immediately recognizing hemorrhagic shock. That's when I also broke free and went to sprint toward the emergency phone, but Jackson grabbed me back by my leg, both of us fighting on the floor while he typed one-handed, "caller exaggerating, minor scrape." At minute 15, when Shania fainted and her 7-year-old daughter took the phone, I bit Jackson's hand hard enough to draw blood and lunged for his laptop, managing to type "send" before he slammed it shut on my fingers, crushing them against the keyboard while the little girl asked if her brother was going to heaven. I kicked him in the stomach, grabbed my cell phone, but he had a signal jammer in his drawer that he held up like a trophy while pinning me against the wall with his forearm across my throat, choking me just enough that I couldn't scream the address to my coworkers, all while the veteran performed chest compressions in my ear, counting out loud as the child went into cardiac arrest from blood loss. The second Jackson's administrative lock expired at exactly 23 minutes. I slammed every dispatch button on my console, sending 3 ambulances and a helicopter to that apartment, while Jackson was still gloating about his perfect system. I looked up at the sky and started pleading with every deity out there to save this child. After 4 excruciating minutes, help finally arrived and rushed into the house immediately. The call was still going on, and I could hear major panicking going on. The medics walked over to the child, and I couldn't make out what they said. But one thing was clear. The mother dropped to her knees and started cry-screaming. I heard commotion before everyone finally left. I started calling and digging into the case like a madman, before finally finding out the truth. The child was gone, or at least the version his mother remembered was. He had lost so much blood he'd need multiple surgeries for internal damage. His prefrontal cortex was damaged, leaving him unable to speak, leaving his mother with bills she couldn't afford without selling their house. Just as a cherry on top from the American healthcare system. I went to report Jackson immediately, but HR said I needed proof. That's how I learned the dispatch system auto-delete supervisor overrides after 24 hours, standard privacy protection. Jackson knew this, which is why he was so comfortable doing it, and when I checked, 5 other dispatchers quietly told me he'd done this before, always to addresses in poor neighborhoods. I sat in my car holding my phone, having secretly recorded Jackson admitting everything when he'd bragged to another supervisor at lunch, him laughing about how those people don't even have lawyers, when I got his text. "I know you recorded me, but I also know you used the emergency alert system without authorization when you sent those ambulances. That's immediate termination and loss of your certification. Your choice. Delete the recording or never work as a dispatcher again. You have until tomorrow morning." My hands shook so bad I dropped my phone twice trying to read his message again. I sat there in my car for 2 whole hours, playing Jackson's text over and over while also listening to my recording of him at lunch. He was laughing about how those people don't even have lawyers and bragging about doing this before. My brain kept doing the math over and over. 20 hours left before the system would delete everything that proved what he did to that baby. I finally started my car and drove home, my fingers still shaking as I gripped the wheel. The second I got inside my apartment, I grabbed my laptop and started uploading that recording everywhere I could think of. 3 different cloud services, plus a USB drive that I wrapped in plastic and hid inside an old cereal box in my closet. Then I went crazy, taking photos with my phone of every screen, every log entry, anything from work that might disappear when that timer hit 0. My eyes burned from staring at screens, but I couldn't stop. At 3 in the morning, I texted Jeremy Winters from IT. We went through training together, and he'd mentioned once how much he hated the override system. I typed out something about needing help with a technical issue and asked if we could grab coffee before my next shift. My phone rang at 8 the next morning while I was still at my computer. Zara Hurley from HR, her voice doing that fake calm thing as she reminded me about company policies on unauthorized recordings. She talked about proper chain of command and how serious these violations were. Someone had already told her about my report attempt, and she was basically warning me to back off. I met Jeremy later in his beat-up Honda behind the grocery store on 5th Street. We both kept looking around like we were doing a drug deal or something. He explained that there was this vendor backup system that saves everything for 30 days, but only cops with subpoenas could get to it. Still, just knowing it existed made me feel less crazy. That afternoon, I tried calling Shania's number from my personal phone, straight to voicemail. I left this stumbling message saying I was the operator from that night and that I tried everything to help. Sorry felt like such a useless word for what happened to her baby. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I just kept replaying those 23 minutes in my head. Her screaming, the veteran neighbor counting chest compressions out loud, the little girl's voice asking if her brother was going to heaven. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Jackson clicking reject on his laptop while watching funny videos on his phone. Hour 22 came, and Jeremy met me at the dispatch center at 5 in the morning while Jackson was off duty. Jeremy used his admin access to get us in, and we started taking screenshots of everything we could find. The logs showed multiple override sessions to poor neighborhoods, but the details were already getting corrupted as the system started its automatic purge. When I got to work for my actual shift that morning, Jackson was already there waiting for me. He mentioned real casual how accidents happen when people forget their place. Then he assigned me to the quietest console way in the back corner, far from everyone else. His threat was clear without him having to actually say it. During my first break, I went to the break room and noticed how all the other dispatchers avoided looking at me. They gave me this wide space like I had something contagious. Word had already spread that I was fighting Jackson, and nobody wanted to risk their job by being seen talking to me. That afternoon around 3 when things got slow, I saw Heather from the union walking toward my console with that careful look people get when they're about to say something risky. She leaned against my desk and kept her voice real low while explaining how she could help me file a formal complaint, but the union had limits because the city kept threatening budget cuts that would wipe out half our jobs. I nodded and followed her down the hall to her small office packed with filing cabinets and union posters, where she pulled out this thick stack of forms that looked more complicated than tax paperwork. During my lunch break, I sat there filling out every single box, keeping my claims narrow and focused on just the override abuse without mentioning the recording yet, because Heather said that would come later. She took the completed forms and filed them right away through the official system, but warned me the response time could be weeks or even months, since the city liked to drag these things out until people gave up. That evening after my shift, I drove to the public library on the other side of town and used one of their old computers to create an anonymous email account with a fake name and no connection to my real identity. I typed out a careful message to Chad Royce, this investigative journalist who'd exposed corruption at the water department last year, telling him I had information about emergency services discrimination, but needed to protect myself. Within 3 hours, Chad had already responded, asking for any documentation I could provide, and whether other people had witnessed similar incidents, because he needed corroboration before his editor would let him run anything. The thought of finding others willing to talk made my stomach hurt since everyone was so scared of losing their jobs, but I started making a mental list of people who might crack if pushed the right way. The next afternoon, right after I clocked in, Zara called my desk phone and told me to come to HR immediately with this fake, pleasant voice that meant trouble. She sat me down in her cold office with its motivational posters and placed this official-looking paper in front of me saying I was on paid administrative leave pending review of policy violations. She framed it like routine procedure, but we both knew it was meant to cut me off from witnesses and any evidence still in the system. That night back at my apartment, I spent hours creating encrypted backups of everything on multiple flash drives and cloud services, making sure Jackson's recording was saved in at least 10 different places. Jackson's deadline had passed that morning, but I hadn't deleted anything and wasn't planning to, so I went to the hardware store and bought new deadbolts for my door, plus a security camera I could monitor from my phone. 2 days later, while I was eating cereal and watching the news, Chad called from a blocked number saying he'd tracked down 3 former dispatchers who'd seen Jackson pull the same override tricks before. One woman had watched him deny ambulances to a homeless camp during that freeze last January when 2 people died from exposure, but she'd been too scared to report it. Jeremy texted me from a burner phone he'd bought at the gas station, warning that the vendor who ran our backup systems had been calling around asking weird questions about access logs. He thought someone was trying to figure out if we'd pulled data from the archives, which meant I needed to be way more careful about leaving digital footprints anywhere. I drove to the hospital where Shania's son was still hooked up to machines in the ICU and left an envelope at the nurse's station with my phone number and an apology letter. The nurse said Shania didn't want to see me, which I understood completely, but I needed her to know someone was fighting to make sure this never happened again. Later that week, I walked into the union meeting at the community center, where about 40 dispatchers had shown up looking nervous and tired. Heather stood at the front, explaining how city council members were threatening to outsource all dispatch services to a private company if the union pushed too hard on oversight issues. Half the room wanted to fight anyway because they'd seen too much abuse, but the other half had kids to feed and mortgages to pay and couldn't risk unemployment. People started arguing about whether standing up for what's right was worth losing everything, and I could see the fear in their eyes because they all knew what Jackson was capable of. Someone mentioned how the last person who'd filed a complaint had their car vandalized and their shifts cut until they quit, which shut down most of the brave talk real quick. I sat there taking notes on everything, documenting who seemed sympathetic and who was clearly on management's side, building my case one piece at a time. The meeting ended with no real decision, except to wait and see what the city would do next, which felt like giving up, but was probably the smart move for people with families. Walking to my car afterward, I noticed someone had stuck a note under my windshield that just said, "Drop it," in block letters, which could have been from anyone but felt like Jackson's style. I took a photo of the note and added it to my growing collection of evidence, knowing every threat and every attempt to silence me just made my case stronger. Brooks McCabe called me 3 days later from the City Oversight Committee saying they'd scheduled a public comment session about dispatch services for next week. He explained I could speak on record about what happened, but warned me that going public would probably kill any chance of keeping my certification. I told him I'd be there anyway, because staying quiet wasn't working out so great either. 2 days after that call, I found a certified letter shoved under my apartment door when I got home from my warehouse job. Jackson had filed an official certification review complaint against me for insubordination and violation of emergency protocols, which meant if it went through, I'd never work in emergency services again. The letter had all this legal language about how I'd exceeded my authority and created unsafe conditions by sending those ambulances without supervisor approval. My hands shook reading it because this was exactly what Jackson had threatened in his text message. Heather called me that same night saying she'd heard about the complaint and wanted to connect me with someone who could help. She gave me Miranda Bell's number, a lawyer who takes whistleblower cases pro bono through the union's legal aid network. I met Miranda at her office downtown the next morning, where she spent 3 hours going through everything I'd documented. She said we had a strong case, but warned the city would fight hard to protect itself because admitting fault meant opening themselves up to lawsuits from every family they'd failed. Miranda started drafting responses to the certification complaint right there while I watched, typing fast on her computer and pulling up laws I'd never heard of. The stress was getting to me bad by then, and I had my first real panic attack while grocery shopping 2 days later. I was reaching for cereal when suddenly I couldn't breathe, and the fluorescent lights got too bright, and I was back in that dispatch room hearing Shania scream while Jackson clicked reject over and over. I dropped my basket and ran outside where I sat on the curb trying to remember how to breathe normally while people walked past staring at me. An older woman stopped and asked if I needed help, but I just shook my head and called the Employee Assistance Program number from my old job packet. They scheduled me an emergency session with Trinity Scions, who specializes in first responder trauma, for the next morning. Trinity's office was small and quiet with these soft chairs that made you sink in deep when you sat down. She didn't make me talk about that night right away, but instead taught me breathing exercises and grounding techniques for when the memories hit. Sunday morning, I woke up to 47 text messages because Chad's first article had dropped online with anonymous sources describing how dispatch services get denied to poor neighborhoods. The city issued a statement within 2 hours, calling everything unsubstantiated allegations from disgruntled former employees, which made me so mad I threw my phone across the room. Monday's paper had the city's full response, where they claimed all dispatch decisions were based on medical triage and resource availability, like it was some noble policy instead of Jackson's cruelty. Reading them turn his evil into bureaucratic language made me physically sick, and I had to run to the bathroom to throw up. After I cleaned myself up, I forwarded Chad the recording of Jackson saying, "Babies bleed all the time," because I couldn't stand them lying anymore. Chad called me 20 minutes later saying this changed everything and asking if I'd be willing to go on record eventually. That same afternoon, Axel Hansen saw Chad's article and reached out to him directly with his own story about that night. Axel provided a detailed timeline that matched my recording perfectly, explaining how he'd found the child in hemorrhagic shock and started compressions while I was fighting Jackson. Chad said having an independent witness who wasn't a city employee made our case way stronger because they couldn't claim Axel was just another disgruntled worker. Word spread fast at the dispatch center that I was probably the leak, and when I went to pick up my last paycheck, someone had left a note on my car windshield calling me a traitor in big block letters. Even the dispatchers who'd privately told me they supported what I was doing wouldn't make eye contact when I walked through the building. One of them, someone I'd eaten lunch with dozens of times, actually turned and walked the other way when she saw me coming down the hall. The certification board sent another letter saying they'd scheduled my hearing for 3 weeks out, which gave me time to prepare, but also meant 3 more weeks of anxiety eating at me. Miranda started building our defense around my duty to report crimes against vulnerable populations, pulling up case law about whistleblowers and emergency services. She had me write down everything I remembered about that night in detail. Every word Jackson said, every button I pushed, every second that passed while that baby was dying. The next week, I managed to catch Jackson during a shift change, when he didn't know I was nearby with my phone recording. He was bragging to another supervisor about how he'd cleaned up the neighborhood problem, and specifically mentioned the signal jammer he'd bought to prevent workarounds during overrides. The other supervisor laughed and said something about keeping the riffraff from clogging up the system, and Jackson agreed, adding that his jammer was the best investment the department never officially made. 2 days later, Heather called me while I was eating cereal and asked if I could meet her at the coffee shop near the Union Hall. I drove over there and found her sitting in the back corner with Chad, both of them looking nervous as I walked up. She pushed a paper across the table that was her official statement saying concerns about override policies had been raised multiple times over the past year. It wasn't naming Jackson directly, but anyone reading between the lines would know what she meant. Chad recorded her saying the union had documented complaints, but management always claimed the system was working as intended. Meanwhile, Jeremy texted me that afternoon saying he'd found something huge in the purchasing system. I met him in the parking garage of a mall 20 minutes from downtown where nobody would recognize us. He showed me his laptop screen with purchase orders from 6 months ago, showing Jackson bought the signal jammer for $800, but listed it as communication equipment for emergency coordination. The vendor description clearly said signal blocking device, but Jackson had changed the item name in the system. Jeremy had screenshots of everything, including the approval signatures from department heads, who probably never looked at what they were signing. That same evening when I got home, I found a certified letter from Zara waiting at my door. My hands shook as I opened it and read the termination proposal giving me 7 days to respond. She listed breach of confidentiality and creating a hostile work environment as the reasons. I immediately called Miranda, who told me not to panic and that she'd file for a stay first thing in the morning. She said you can't fire someone for reporting criminal activity, and we had strong grounds to fight this. 3 days later, I finally worked up the courage to go to the hospital where Shania's son was still recovering. I found her in the cafeteria staring at a cup of coffee that had gone cold. She looked like she'd aged 10 years in 3 weeks with dark circles under her eyes and her hair going gray at the roots. When she saw me, her face crumpled and we both started crying right there in front of everyone. She grabbed my hand and said she didn't blame me, but she couldn't forgive the system that let this happen. She told me a legal aid group had contacted her about suing the city, and she was going to do it for all the other families Jackson had hurt. The oversight meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday at City Hall. I wore my only suit and brought my phone with the recording ready to play. The room was packed with reporters and citizens who'd heard about the case. When they called me to testify, I walked to the microphone with my legs shaking so bad I thought I'd fall. I explained what happened that night, then played the recording through the speaker system. You could hear a pin drop when Jackson's voice filled the room saying the senator's drunk son might crash his BMW, and that's what matters. Several committee members actually gasped when they heard him say, "Babies bleed all the time." After 20 minutes of questions, the committee went into recess, then came back and voted unanimously to order an independent audit of all dispatch policies and override procedures. The chairman said this was the first step toward major reform, though we all knew it would take months before anything actually changed. 2 days later, the news reported Jackson had been placed on paid administrative leave pending the investigation. It made me sick that he was still getting his full salary while sitting at home, but at least he couldn't hurt anyone else from his couch. Miranda said this was standard procedure, and we had to be patient while the legal process played out. With no income and my savings running out fast, I had to find work immediately. I applied to every job I could find, and finally got hired at a warehouse stocking shelves on the night shift. The pay was terrible, and my back hurt from lifting boxes all night, but it covered my rent and kept food in my fridge. Going from saving lives to scanning barcodes was humbling, but I couldn't afford to be picky. Trinity had me come in twice a week to work on coping strategies for the trauma. She taught me breathing exercises where I'd count to 4 breathing in, then hold for 4, then out for 4. We practiced grounding techniques where I'd name 5 things I could see, 4 I could touch, 3 I could hear, 2 I could smell, and 1 I could taste. It helped when the panic attacks hit, which was happening less often. After weeks of these sessions, I was finally sleeping 4 or 5 hours a night, instead of lying awake replaying that call. Jeremy kept digging into the system and discovered the vendor who provided our dispatch software kept a backup of everything for 90 days, not the 30 we'd been told. This meant all the evidence from that night was still intact somewhere on their servers. Miranda immediately filed a motion to subpoena those records, though she warned me the city's lawyers would fight hard to keep them sealed. They'd claim privacy concerns and security risks and drag it out as long as possible. But at least we knew the evidence existed and couldn't be destroyed now that there was a legal hold on it. The next morning, Miranda showed up at my apartment with a stack of papers thick as a phone book and started filling out whistleblower protection forms right there on my kitchen table. She wrote fast while explaining each document and where to sign, her pen moving across the pages as she documented every single time Jackson had punished someone for questioning him. She pulled out copies of old complaints from her briefcase and showed me patterns going back 3 years where dispatchers who spoke up got moved to night shifts or had their hours cut until they quit. We spent 4 hours going through everything, and she made me sign preservation letters that she'd send to everyone at the dispatch center, telling them they couldn't delete any emails or records about my case. My phone started ringing while we were still working, and the caller ID showed it was one of the other supervisors from work. I answered and heard him tell me I was making a big mistake and burning bridges that could never be rebuilt. He kept talking about how small the emergency services community was and how word spreads fast about troublemakers. I put him on speaker so Miranda could hear, and she grabbed her phone to record while he went on about career consequences and how nobody likes a snitch. After he hung up, another supervisor called 5 minutes later with the same kind of threats wrapped in fake concern about my future. Miranda wrote down every word they said and the exact times they called, building a file that showed clear retaliation. By noon, we had 6 different calls documented, and Miranda said this was exactly the evidence we needed to prove they were trying to intimidate me. Chad called that afternoon to tell me his second article was going live in an hour, with the actual dispatch logs Jeremy and I had saved before they got deleted. He'd spent days verifying everything and cross-referencing the addresses with census data that showed a clear pattern of discrimination. When the article went up online, it spread faster than the first one, and within 2 hours, 3 city council members had posted statements distancing themselves from the dispatch department. They all used the same careful language about being deeply concerned and calling for immediate investigation, but you could tell they were scared of being connected to this mess. The comment section exploded with people sharing their own stories about calling 911 from poor neighborhoods and waiting forever for help that sometimes never came. My certification hearing was scheduled for the next week, and Miranda spent every day preparing me for what they'd ask. She had me practice answering questions about why I sent those ambulances without authorization, and we went over my response about having a duty to save lives. The morning of the hearing, I put on my only suit and drove to the state building where 5 board members sat behind a long table looking serious. They asked me to explain what happened that night, and I told them everything while they took notes and whispered to each other. One board member asked why I didn't follow proper channels, and I explained about the 23-minute lock in Jackson's signal jammer. Another wanted to know if I understood I'd violated protocol, and I said yes, but that a child's life was more important than protocol. After 2 hours of questions, they went into a private room to discuss, and came back saying they'd continue the case instead of stripping my certification right away. They said the whistleblower claims needed to be investigated before they could punish me for insubordination, which meant I had more time to fight. 3 weeks later, the independent audit report came out and confirmed everything we'd been saying about systematic bias in emergency response. The data showed poor neighborhoods got service an average of 12 minutes slower than rich areas during override situations. The report used careful language, but the numbers were clear that this wasn't random or accidental, but an actual policy. They found 67 instances in the past year where supervisors had delayed or denied service to certain zip codes. The city held an emergency meeting the next day and announced they were changing the override system immediately. From now on, it would take 2 supervisors to agree before denying any service request, and everything would be logged permanently. It was a small change that might save some lives, but it didn't fix the whole system, or bring back the people who'd already died waiting for help. Zara called me that afternoon and asked me to come to her office to discuss my situation. She sat behind her desk and slid a piece of paper across to me, offering a deal where I'd resign with a neutral reference if I dropped everything. She said fighting would just drag this out for months, and I'd probably lose anyway, plus I had bills to pay and no income. The paper said they'd drop the certification challenge and I could work somewhere else, but I had to sign right then. I told her I needed to talk to Miranda first, and she gave me 24 hours to decide. Miranda and I met at a coffee shop and went over the pros and cons of taking the deal versus fighting to the end. She said we had a strong case, but these things could take years, and the city had deep pockets to keep fighting while I was already broke. After talking for 2 hours, I decided to take the deal but negotiate for better terms. The next morning, I went back to Zara's office and said I'd accept if they kept my benefits through the end of the year. She made some calls and came back saying they'd agree to that, plus 3 months of severance pay if I signed a statement saying I was leaving for personal reasons. I signed the papers and walked out of that building for the last time, knowing I'd never work there again. Over the next month, I applied to every dispatch center within driving distance, but got rejection emails from the first 3 before I even got interviews. Word had already spread through the whole emergency services network that I was the whistleblower who'd caused all the trouble. Nobody wanted to hire someone who might report problems or challenge supervisors, even if what I did was right. Meanwhile, Shania had connected with a legal aid group that specialized in civil rights cases, and they were preparing to sue the city. She called me one evening and said she was doing it for all the families who'd lost someone to Jackson's resource allocation system, and asked if I'd testify if needed. I told her yes without even thinking about it. The next week, I started teaching basic first aid classes at the community center on 5th Street, right in Shania's neighborhood. The building was old with peeling paint and broken AC, but the room filled up with parents who wanted to learn how to help their kids when ambulances took too long. I showed them how to stop bleeding with towels and pressure, how to recognize when someone was going into shock, basic CPR on the practice dummies the fire department donated. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, I drove there after my warehouse shift, teaching what I could while my certification case dragged on. 3 weeks later, the certification board finally sent their decision letter. My hands shook opening it in my car outside the warehouse. 3-month suspension instead of permanent revocation, they wrote, due to the whistleblower circumstances and the evidence I'd provided about Jackson's pattern. It hurt seeing my license suspended, but at least I'd be able to work again someday. That same afternoon, the news broke about Jackson's reassignment. The city moved him to some admin job in the permits department where he'd never touch emergency services again. Full salary and pension intact, of course. The prosecutor's office sent me a form letter saying they wouldn't file criminal charges because proving intent would be too difficult even with my recordings. I crumpled it up and threw it in my apartment dumpster. 2 months into my suspension, I got an email from a dispatch center in a rural county about 2 hours north. They'd seen the news coverage and wanted to offer me a probationary position starting after my suspension ended. The pay was $12,000 less than my old job, and the commute would eat up 4 hours a day plus gas money, but it was the only offer I'd gotten. I called them back and accepted on the spot. The week before I was supposed to leave the city, Shania asked me to meet her at a coffee shop near the hospital. Her son was there in a special wheelchair, his head supported by cushions. He couldn't talk, but when she said my name, his eyes tracked toward me, and his hand moved slightly. She told me he'd started responding to some commands in therapy, could move his right hand a little, was learning to communicate with eye movements on a special board. The therapist said he'd never walk or talk again, but he was making tiny improvements every week. She thanked me for standing up to Jackson, even though it came too late for her baby. I couldn't stop the tears when she hugged me goodbye. I spent the next 3 days packing everything I owned into boxes. My lease was up anyway, and I couldn't afford the rent without a real job. Most of my stuff went into a storage unit, and I loaded just the basics into my car. The rural county job would barely cover a studio apartment up there, plus my student loans and the gas for commuting. I'd have to pick up weekend shifts somewhere to make ends meet, but at least I'd be working dispatch again. The morning before I left, the city announced new oversight rules for emergency services. 2 supervisors would have to agree on any service denial now, and they'd keep records for 5 years instead of 24 hours. They also started mandatory anti-bias training for all dispatch staff, 8 hours every year. It wasn't enough to fix the system, but maybe it would stop the next Jackson from having total control over who lived and who died. My first day at the rural dispatch center came on a cold Monday morning 5 months after that horrible night. The drive took 2 hours and 15 minutes through farm country and small towns. The building was tiny compared to the city center, just 6 workstations and a converted fire station. They gave me the overnight shift nobody else wanted, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., handling calls for 3 small towns and all the empty highways between them. As I drove up that first morning, watching the sun rise over cornfields, I kept thinking about those 23 minutes. Shania's screaming, the veteran counting compressions, Jackson clicking reject over and over. The weight of it sat heavy in my chest and always would. But I'd done the right thing by speaking up even though it cost me my career in the city, my apartment, most of my savings. Staying quiet would have been worse. Would have made me just like those other dispatchers who looked away. At least now I could work again, could help people again, even if it was in a place where Jackson's influence couldn't reach. The rural center's parking lot was almost empty when I pulled in, just 2 other cars there for the day shift I'd be replacing. I grabbed my coffee and walked toward the door, ready to start over in a place where nobody knew my name yet. Hey, thanks for letting me wander through all this with you today. That was a fun ride. I really appreciate you sticking around. I'll see you next time. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.